Session 26, we're going to cover the last portions of this master cycle as we went through everything in the past couple of sessions. Let's start. In this first part, we're going to cover those last bits of information that were left from Don asking the end of the master cycle, all the things that had to do with the Confederation, the Orion Group influencing humanity, and we're now getting into the last couple of hundred years of our era and getting close to now. So in this first part, we're going to cover all those things, and then in part two, we're going to cover the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing, which it has some pretty good information about what the Confederation actually did back then, but we're going to cover that in part two. Also, because this is the last session in the original book format, meaning that this was the last session in book one before going into book two, there is some information at the end that is switched over or around, and I kind of manage it in a way that it makes sense for the raw contact version that I'm using to create the series. So you're going to see that information next week and explain it why I did what I did, and it's just going to make sense then. And that's basically it. We're going to cover all of that, and we are going to start with the session. Now, I excluded the first three questions because, again, it had to do with Carla, and I'm just gonna, because I think it's just entertaining to see how some of the answers were made by Ra. So even though I didn't include him here, I'm just gonna read it from the text itself, just because it's I find it funny, actually. I gotta be honest. I do find it funny. So the first question that Don asked is, is any of the changing of what we have done here for the instrument going to affect communication of the instrument in any way? Have we set up here all right? And Ra says this is correct. Now this is coming from some alterations that they did from the past session, and Don was asking if everything was fine, for the raw contact, and they say, yeah, this is correct. And then Don says, and you mean that everything is satisfactory for continued communication? And they say, we meant that the changes affect this communication. So yeah, it wasn't very clear. And then Don continues and says, should we discontinue this communication because of these changes, or should we continue? And Ra says, you may do as you wish. However, we would be unable to use the instrument at this space-time nexus without these modifications. Again, I just wanted to read that out because it does show how they're very careful to give information about anything, especially when they're asked if they should do something, like, should I do something? They say, well, hey, that's not my call, that's yours. So it's really up to you. But in any case, we won't be able to use this instrument without the modifications that they did. So anyhow, just wanted to read that to you. All right, so now we're going to go into the real meat of this session. And when Don is asking the first question that I have here, moving on to this, Don says, assuming that is all right to continue, we're down to the last 3,000 years of this present cycle, and I was wondering if the law of one in either written or spoken form has been made available within this past 3,000 years in any complete way, such as we are doing now. Is it available in any other source? And Ra says, there is no possibility of a complete source of information of the law of one in this density. However, certain of your writings passed to you as your so-called holy works have portions of this law. Now, this is something that we see a lot whenever they refer to the law of one being transmitted here, because of the nature of the law of one, the perspective and everything. And this goes with every density, actually, because the law of one is something that, even though it bathes all densities, it's only fully understood beyond this density, of course, and mostly in 6th density. But the point is that whenever the law of one is being transmitted into to our density, it's not in its full form. It's only an approximation. There's only sort of like a reference to what it is. It's almost like trying to explain what source is. It's really hard for us to comprehend this, and that's why in, say, Eastern philosophy, it's impossible to describe that which is the Tao, say, or Zen. It's not possible to describe in words. It's not even easy to kind of explain it. So in the same way, this is the law of one here. And I think there are so many parallels with all our philosophies in the past. And yeah, I just wanted to make that distinction there. So the holy works, however, it's going to make Don ask the next question, because Ra was saying that some of the law of one was there. So Don says, does the Bible as we know it have portions of this law in it? Ra says, this is correct. Don says, can you tell me if the Old Testament has any of the law of one? And Ra says, this is correct. And now Don says, which has more of the law of one in it, the Old Testament or the New Testament? Ra says, withdrawing from each of the collections of which you speak, the portions having to do with the law of one, the content is approximately equal. However, the so-called Old Testament has a larger amount of negatively influenced material, as you would call it. So, right off the bat, they're saying that the Old Testament has a large amount of negatively influenced material. Why? My speculation is because the Old Testament has a lot of people writing it, and all the situations happening at that time where the Old Testament was written. All those stories has a lot of influence by negative material, say, and that has to do with the nature of channeling and things that happen and how humans react to these type of apparitions and thought forms and channelings themselves, or say visions and so on. So I think it has to do with the amount of people that were there in writing this Old Testament, whereas the New Testament is basically all of Jesus and his disciples. So it's clear to see why the Old Testament would have a lot of negatively influenced material. And of course, we don't have to be theologists to know that the Old Testament is actually charged or loaded with a lot of that old Yahweh, or the Orion Yahweh. If you remember from session 16, 24, we also talked about it, and session 16, 18, and 24. So if you haven't, go watch about Yahweh and you'll see why the Orion group had this manipulation over the humanity at that time, which is the Old Testament. So, all right, just wanted to make a point there. Next question is Don saying, which has more of the law of one in it, the Old Testament or the New Testament? And Ra says, we prefer that this be left to the discretion of those who seek the law of one. We are not speaking in order to judge. Such statements would be construed by some of those who may read this material as judgmental. We can only suggest a careful reading and inward digestion of the contents. The understandings will become obvious. If I could take anything from this is, and I'll talk about this in the conclusions of this video, is that Ra is very careful, or they are very careful, to give information that can create a sort of idea of how we should see things. Specifically here, knowing that a percentage has, say, a percentage of something is negative, you will start, it's going to change your perception. And they're always careful not to change perception, say, in Don and the group, but also us who are reading the material now. We are a product of that channeling, a lot of us. And so they're very careful not to do this because they know the repercussions of doing this back in Egypt and all the mess that we have now because of what they did. And again, it's not that it's their fault, but it's just their influence and the distortions that they cause, what they're trying to mend now. So you see this a lot in the material, and I think there's so much power into reading this to know that this is something that it's important to keep in mind. And they always suggest that the understandings will become obvious once you read it and you interpret it. There is something also, I'm going to invite you, of course, to don't miss part 2, because they're going to end on something that is, it's so poetic that I love it. But that again is going to be in part 2 when we end this session and first book, like I said before. So really, really important is, I usually geek out on some of the information that seems irrelevant to the book, but I think it's because there's so much meaning into it, and that is the interpretation that we give to things. We are very accustomed to give interpretations to things and give power to that. So again, part 2, we're going to cover some of that. Let's just go back and track and continue with the material, where Don says, has Ra communicated with any of our population in this century in the last, say, 80 years? And they say, we have not. Don says, has the law of one been communicated within the past 80 years by any other source to an entity in our population? Ra says, the ways of one have seldom been communicated, although there are rare instances in the previous 80 of your years, as you measure time. There have been many communications from 4 density due to the drawing towards the harvest to 4 density. These are the ways of universal love and understanding. The other teachings are reserved for those whose depth of understanding, if you will excuse the misnomer, recommend and attract such further communication. I think it's so cool the way they use understanding, and then they say, sorry to use this misnomer because you are not in a position of understanding. I think they've said it in the past sessions, or they say it in the future, but they always make emphasis saying that understanding is not of this density. Understanding is not of, it's not for us. And this goes back to what I was talking about previous, when they don't give information on certain things because we don't understand. We're not here to understand. We're here to just live and feel and have our own discernment. It's okay. We're not being judged. We're not being tested. It's just a matter of us blooming. There is no testing in a flower as it blooms. There is no, wow, this one is good, this one is bad, this one is missing some petals, this one has whatever. You know, there is no judgment there. It just blooms. It doesn't care. It just happens. That's us humans. We are supposed to be that. But for the past 10,000 years or so, we have been in this intellectual mentality and very male-oriented, organized, that we need to understand everything. Our science speaks and actually reeks of that. So I think that's pretty cool to mention. The other thing is that they're saying that yes, there have been communication from 4 density because how we are near the harvest period. So there's, I would say, a thinning of the veil that we have between 3rd and 4th density, as we're vibrating already in 4 density frequencies. So this is very impactful in the communications that have been happening, but not so much the law of one or the ways of one as they have said it. It's more just this brotherhood communication between 4th and 3rd density, and I think that's pretty cool. So the last thing that I'm going to mention that I forgot to say is that Carlo is still a little sick, and they make her cough a couple of times, and I skipped one question also where there was miscommunication there between Don and Ra, but you're going to see that the questions actually skip now and then, so just wanted to say that. All right, let's go back to the next question, where Don says, did the Confederation then step up its program of helping planet Earth sometime late in the last major cycle? It seems that they did from the previous data, especially with the Industrial Revolution. Can you tell me the attitudes and reasonings behind this step up? Is there any reason other than that they just wanted to produce more leisure time in the last, say, 100 years of the cycle? Is this the total reason? Ra says, this is not the total reason. Approximately 200 of your years in the past, as you measure time, there began to be a significant amount of entities who, by seniority, were incarnating for learned teaching purposes, rather than for the lesser of the learned teachings of those less aware of the process. This was our signal to enable communication to take place. So, a couple of things to remember here. It's the Industrial Revolution. Remember from session 11, if you haven't watched, go watch that. It's going to make more sense as to how they influenced the Industrial Revolution in this case. And Don is asking from that previous material if there was another reason why, aside from leisure time, that it was supposed to be for us, if there was another reason. And Ra says, yes, there was another reason. And this one can get a little bit complicated if you don't read it thoroughly, when they say that there began to be a significant amount of entities who, by seniority, were incarnating for learned teaching purposes. Now, in one of the sessions, I forgot which one it was, we were talking about the incarnation process and priorities that exist towards the end of a cycle, where those who need just the least amount of, say, learnings to ascend into fourth and so on, they were given priority by seniority. That's their seniority. So, in essence, what's happening is that those souls who are close to achieving, say, harvestable energy, harvestable conditioning, they were given priority to start coming here. So I would say, and this makes sense, you know, we talked about this again in one of the sessions. Out of the top of my head, I don't remember. If I do remember and I check it out, I'll put it in one of the comments. But in any case, that's what's happening here, and that's what they're saying. By seniority, they were incarnating here. So these souls came with some previous knowledge and more understanding of the nature of this reality. So because of that, they were given the opportunity, and they were not incarnating here more for the lesser of the learned teachings of those less aware of the process. So they were here to get that last bit of knowledge or understanding, or just experience itself, to ascend, and not so much to give information to other people who were not that aware of the process. So it's almost like, and I hate to use this word, but it was a refining process of incarnative choices from the souls that were coming here. And like I said, it makes sense from the perspective of the soul group that would give priority to those who know that can come here in the last couple of years of this cycle to try and be harvestable, as opposed to those who knew that they had to repeat the cycle. So that's and of course this was their signal to enable communication to take place in the way that they did with wanderers and so on. We're going to talk about one of them here, which is kind of a strange and weird case, but I'm not going to give any spoilers. Let's go on with the rest of the answer that Ra has. And they say, the wanderers which came among you began to make themselves felt at approximately this time. Firstly, offering ideas or thoughts containing the distortions of free will. This was the prerequisite for further wanderers which had information of a more specific nature to offer. The thought must precede the action. So, again, these wanderers began themselves to they were coming here and they were offering ideas and thoughts containing the distortion of free will, which is, as we have known, the changes in society that we've had for the past 200 years, and in terms of our societal arrangements and the revolutions themselves, all these kind of stuff that started happening, coming out from the oppression of the empire, say. So a lot of changes were happening then, and this was to give a lot more, as we can see, or the intent was, of course, you know, the negative entities have always been mischievous, and anything that the Confederation does, they have to balance with their negativity. And of course, our very susceptible society to hierarchical processes, we have this world now. So we're still in this, I wouldn't call it battle. I don't like the word battle. I would call it more of a dance between the positive and the negative, and how the positive influences and the negative just kind of, you know, turns it around. We keep, you know, going into this wavy form. I prefer to see it this way. It's I don't know, it's much more wholesome. But that's again my hippie mentality. So yeah, this was a prerequisite for wanderers which had the information of a more specific nature to offer, clearly. And then the thought must precede the action, which, you know, the thought was sensitive and sensible in the wanderer's mind, or your wanderer's mind, because if you're listening to this, chances are you're a wanderer. So thank you for watching. All right, so let's go to the next question, where Don says, wondering if the one Abraham Lincoln could have possibly been a wanderer. Surprise, surprise. Ra says, this is incorrect. This entity was a normal, shall we say, earth being which chose to leave the vehicle and allow an entity to use it on a permanent basis. This is relatively rare compared to the phenomenon of wanderers. You would do better considering the incarnations of wanderers, such as the one known as Thomas, and the one known as Benjamin. Okay, I wish I had more information about this rare thing that Ra is explaining that happened with Lincoln. So, Lincoln actually left his body and allowed a fourth, a spoiler, big spoiler, all right, a fourth density entity to come into him. We're gonna get more info into this, but just to set the stage, this is what they're saying it happened. Lincoln's soul kind of left, and then it was embodied by a fourth density being. Let's go more into that. Don says, I'm assuming you meant Thomas Edison and Benjamin Franklin. And Ra says, this is incorrect. We were intending to convey the sound vibration complex, Thomas Jefferson, the other correct. All right, really quick note here. Ra mentioned those because Don originally asked if Lincoln was a wanderer, and Ra said, no, you should consider Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. So those are the two that were wanderers. But now Don is going to ask the question that we all want to know following Lincoln's depossession. Don says, thank you. Can you tell me where the entity that used Lincoln, Abraham's body, what density he came from and where? All right, I spoiled this already. This entity was fourth vibration. And then Don says, I assume positive. They say that is correct. And was his assassination in any way influenced by Orion or any other negative force? And they say this is correct. So again, we don't know much in this session, but I can tell you from other session, I forgot which number they talk again. I think it's 35, 36, might be off, where they talk about Lincoln again. And there was they explain better the process there, and we're gonna get to that eventually. It's only a couple of sessions away, so don't fret. You can go and read the material if you want to get more explicit information on that. But yeah, apparently Lincoln's body or soul left the body and allowed this positive entity to embody him. This was done, again, you can read in the material, I believe it was 1853. I'm not very familiar with Lincoln's biography, but I know this was the time where he was getting ready to join the Republican Party and so on. Like I said, I'm not big on history in that regard with the founding fathers, but you can find some more information if you want. I know it was 1853 where they say this happened, and that's basically it. Now, again, we're going to cover this in later material with the corresponding session, which I tend to forget. All right, so this is all we got for this part of session 26, and in session part 2 of session 26, where we're going to cover and wrap up this intention that Don had with the first book, and also finish up with a couple of things that were switched around there. We're going to talk about that in the next video, of course, and it's going to be interesting because we're going to talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the nuclear bombing and all that stuff. Now, conclusions are something very important that I actually would love to go back to, and it had to do with when they say that this is the most practical conclusion that I would love to share with you guys with the material that we read today, because it's fascinating to me how there are so many things that we can learn and pick from this material that is helpful for us and our ways to live here with a philosophy. Well, remember, you're listening to a philosopher here, or somebody who likes to philosophize about things, rather. I don't like the titles themselves, but in this case, when they're talking about reading the material, accepting the material, or just absorbing any sort of information and having our own discernment, that's what they're talking about. We are obsessed with getting the right information, the true of the matter. These things are very conventional science, our way of thinking, in that we need to find the fundamental particle of the universe. We need to find the ultimate reality. We need to find whatever. There is no ultimate truth or anything. This is within the constraints of thinking that we are alone in this universe, that we are the maximum expression, or we are this awakened sentient being that is looking for conquering space and time and all this stuff. Well, if you think that way, then yes, you're going to follow this line of thinking where you believe there is one way of interpreting things. And it's a good footnote here to say that my interpretation is definitely not final or ultimate. I would be contradicting myself really bad here. But my way of seeing this is that when we see material, and this goes back to the question 26.8, where they were talking about the Bible itself and how much it was percentage negative or influenced by the Orion group and so on. We don't need to know that. We don't have to know what percentage it's going to influence us, and it's better for us to just absorb the material and just have our own discernment, whatever we believe. There is one thing that I will probably talk about in the future, which is the solar flash, and I keep getting these questions in the comments about the solar flash. In both channels, my Spanish channel and this one, I hear about the solar flash, and I'll have my own opinion in due time. But there is this idea, there's going to happen a solar flash because some information has been transmitted about a possible solar event that will transform everything. And the information is out there. Anybody can read and have their own opinions. But I'll tell you something, just for your own discernment, without giving my own opinion on it. When you read something and it resonates with you, it doesn't matter if the rest of the world thinks otherwise. It's what you feel. And if you feel it's right for you. If there is some sort of negative feeling that comes to you, some feeling of fear or despair or doom scenario or that kind of stuff, that seems to be the signature of negative entities or the Orion group influencing us or creating that idea. So it's your own heart telling you probably not the right thing for you, not the right thing in the universe, in the cosmos, the creator's rightfulness. Nothing to do with that. But for you. And there's a reason you have your own independent way of seeing things, because you have your own path of awakening. Very different from mine, anybody else. So I think that's very important. Discernment is the key word here. So with that, I'm coming to the end of my conclusion and the end of this part 1 of session 26. Again, tune in for part 2 of session 26, where we're going to cover that part of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the nuclear bombing, and something that the Confederation did, which is amazing, the type of work that they do, and giving our own infant mentality of destroying ourselves. So that's going to be pretty cool. All right, with that, I leave you. Subscribe if you haven't, like if you liked it, dislike if you disliked it. Doesn't matter, just express yourself, be yourself, and I'll see you in part 2. Thank you.